That was circulated a few days ago, so on the assumption that everyone has had an opportunity of reading it, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the July meeting.
So moved.
Seconded by Commissioner Truesdale. Any further discussion about the minutes? If not, all in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposition. The minutes are approved. The next item on the agenda is an update or report from the Rochester Police Department. Chief Peterson.
Most of the items for discussion are already on the agenda.
Yes.
So if there are specific areas that the commission would like me to address, I'd be happy to do that. Otherwise, we can
Move on
with the discussion as outlined in the agenda.
Okay. Are there any questions from commissioners or any members of the public who have any questions for Chief Peterson? If not, we'll move on and then we can keep those. Yes.
Chair, as long as we have the opportunity to, depending on the discussion items, whether or not the chief at that time offers information that we may discuss, you're not saying if we don't raise it at this time, we won't be able to?
No, absolutely. Any questions you have, I'll be happy to. I just didn't want to waste your time.
Sure.
If I didn't necessarily.
So I'm going to hold over public comment unless there are any questions or comments at this time until Chief Peterson has dealt with whatever he does have to say, including the report that was circulated regarding the investigative findings in respect of Officer Benchley. So Chief Peterson.
Okay, we're on 6.
Yeah.
Our last meeting, Commissioner Jordan asked that you be given a copy of the investigative findings from that complaint, which I assume that you received.
Yes.
I'd be happy to answer questions about that. Probably to put that in context, as you're aware, the investigation was not conducted by the Rochester Police Department, but by an independent investigator, and the report that you received was from that investigator outlining the findings and relevant exhibits, etc. Subsequent to that, any decisions relative to discipline or disposition in regard to that complaint were mine. So while I can't speak to the content of the investigation, I can speak to those other issues. And I would open that up to for any question or discussion about that.
Thank you. Let's open this for discussion. I'm not sure, I imagine the members of the commission have had access to this particular report. I don't know how many members of the public have had access to this report. But let's just respond to questions from commissioners.
Well, just a point of inquiry. Was there an internal audit that perhaps led you or the department to convene or request an outside firm to conduct an investigation?
No, to be specific about that was not the result of an internal audit. It was actually the result of additional information being provided to me directly by the original complainants, members of Rochester for Justice, that provided information that indicated there was a potential conflict of interest in how that investigation was being conducted. That led to 2 separate investigations, one on the original complaint and one on our professional standards manager at that time. That was not due to an audit, but in regard to additional information that was provided relevant to the first complaint.
Thank you.
Yes.
Kerry, that email that you sent, I have received, but I'll be honest with you, I haven't opened it because, and it said redacted, kind of like. So I'm guessing the reason it was redacted was privacy issues or to that effect, or.
Right.
So what would be the benefit of us reading that report without not even be able to read everything else on the report?
Well, I think the relevant to the release of information in any personnel investigation, they're necessarily going to be things that by state law are not public information. We don't make that decision as a department. That request was made sent to Human Resources, and between Human Resources, the City Attorney's Office, and a separate consulting attorney, the decision is made is what information can be released publicly and what information necessarily has to be redacted. I did review that report, and the only information redacted from that report is identifying information relevant to another complaint or the other complaint that was received in conjunction with it.
In conjunction with the other case.
Right, so there is no information relevant to, for instance, the Ben Schlag that was redacted. But relevant to the other personnel investigation that was conducted, there necessarily would have been.
But even though that person ever resigned, still that information is deemed from the state or from whoever lawmakers have to be private?
Yes.
Doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of the investigation itself if something is going to be private and this thing is supposed to be public?
Well, I'm not going to speak to the wisdom of the state statute. I am going to speak to the necessity of complying with it. I think I've stated before, and I will state again, my great preference would be that everything is laid out on the table and that there not be any information relevant to certainly public decisions that are made. We do, in regard to the personnel section of data privacy, as I said, it's not discretionary, it's not an option on our part whether we release or don't release that information.
Okay.
That's what the state law requires. We do consult with the city attorney's office in that regard. And as I said, probably I think equally important for you to remember that we're not, as a police department, saying we're not going to share this information with you. If it was up to me, there wouldn't be any redaction. But there are legal standards, and we do rely on the attorney's staff to make those decisions.
There's actually very, very little redaction in the report.
And that concerns, like the chief said, that concerns to the other party that was involved. At this point,
If you haven't seen it, I'm just informing you that there's very, very, very little redaction, 2% at most.
I have downloaded it, but I haven't read it. And I saw the redacted part of it. Thank you.
Wanting to give other commissioners an opportunity first before I offer a follow-up question. But, so there was a subsequent investigation, for want of a better word, to occur regarding the professional standards manager that, because of the additional information brought forth, was also a part of this wide range, well, my words, this additional review. Was it because we didn't ask for the findings regarding professional standards managers, is that why we weren't provided that? Or, as I attempted to follow the conversation, or is it being suggested that that particular investigation falls totally under the FOIA, or I'm sorry, under the privacy concerns?
It would be the latter, that the information contained and the status of that investigation and subsequent report would make that private data, in that the investigation was not fully completed and a final disposition made. There was a resignation prior to that, which impacted the availability of that.
Okay, thank you.
Are you able to disclose the discussions that you had with the officer involved in this particular investigation regarding the postings that were made?
Yes, I mean, I can certainly discuss.
Can you speak to that?
That initially, upon this complaint being made, there was, contrary to perhaps what most people feel would happen or naturally happen, the officer in this case had immediately contacted the department and had immediately frozen or locked down their social media account, not out of any defensive posture, but out of saying, whatever I did, and felt it was incumbent on him to preserve that evidence, whether or not it resulted in disciplinary action, and was very candid and forthcoming that there wasn't the usual, can we prove that the officer did this or did that? Very honest about what had occurred. There's certainly a different interpretation as far as what his intent was. I think I can fairly characterize probably his social media awareness as being almost non-existent. That is, he was convinced by his friends in the military that he should have this account that they shared what he thought was either humorous or private information. So given that level of awareness, during the course of that, he had interacted with the department, members of management, a member of management that indicated that there was a private media, social media account, so there wasn't a problem with what he was doing. And however ill-advised that was, from the management standpoint, I think we need to take responsibility for that. And that's part of what you see is the result of this. Since that time, his response has been, number one, very apologetic, recognizing that while he did not intend or hadn't intended his posts to be interpreted as they were, he recognized they were certainly offensive and volunteered his own time and expense to attend educational and training, in this case one-on-one training with a consultant from a separate firm from the city. He completed that. He also completed a disciplinary suspension. We have had the opportunity to talk about that experience, which frankly he is quite interested in making this a more productive situation other than just crime punishment, but actually taking that experience and has offered and requested to speak to officers about his experience, what was said and done, how that impacted people not only in the community but within the department, what his own experience was from that, what he learned from that, and being able to relate some of that experience so officers have a better understanding certainly of how social media can impact, but more specifically to the point of how, while whether intended or not, that the social media posts in particular can really undermine certainly the mission, the objectives of the department, and an individual's ability to work as a police officer, and how that impacts their job or potentially impacts their job. He was very clear on making this, as I said, more than simply I did something wrong and was punished for it, but relating an experience that hopefully everybody can learn from, certainly police officers. As I've said, as bad as the situation was and has been, I think the silver lining in that is it does give us the opportunity as a department to confront these issues, but also that Officer Flag is not the only person learning from it. In fact, it's a good point for our staff and certainly for management to address these issues outside of a hypothetical. That is that these are issues that we need to deal with, and I think it's given us the platform to do that in a much more constructive way.
Questions?
Is there anybody else? I already
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sometimes what happens is like someone like me with lack of experience on this situation is like, when some things are said and done. Like last meeting when I went home, it kind of occurred to me like what you were saying in regards to this issue that you said like, we need to go higher level up to straighten the rules from there and then come down back up. So for someone like me, if I can put it in layman's terms, on the street language terms, you yourself just let off the hook, and I'm not like, saying like, disagreeing what you just said, but in general terms, you just let off the hook such a person. Don't you think when we go to the higher level, they can even give as much like, empathy as to like, the cases that were being discussed in that level and then come back up, they can do better. Do you understand what I'm trying to, the two things I'm trying to compare?
Well, I want to be clear.
Yeah, like someone will come up and say, you yourself just let off the hook this person that most of community or most of the general public think he has did this horrible thing. So why do you expect when we go higher up level, things are going to be different? And it's going to be even more complex issues and more challenging issues, even on a national level.
Okay.
Like you advised us last time when we were here, which there's nothing wrong with it, like, organizing in a grassroots, like, and going to try and have an effect and change the laws the way they are written right now.
Well, I think that there's really a parallel here, so I appreciate the perspective. In regard to the officer, I do need to look at content, and I do understand. In this case, Ben Schlag was an officer who worked for us for 5 years.
Exactly.
12 letters of appreciation or commendation, no misconduct. Were the posts offensive? Yes, they were. I think if you read the report indicated that there were plausible explanations. They weren't intended to be either racially or religiously biased. I didn't feel it was my job to sort out whether he intended that or not. They were offensive. That was the point. The question being, what's the appropriate response to that? In my view, I am, number one, I tell every officer that comes on the department, every employee that comes on the department, there are two things that will get you fired on the department. One is acting maliciously, and I define that as hurting somebody knowing you don't have just cause to hurt. And two is dishonesty. And I think that's self-explanatory. In this case, Ben's response was, of course, very honest and very candid and forthright, and he did the things that I would hope an officer would do if he was accused of misconduct. So it wasn't a question for me of firing for any of those two that I draw on a very firm line. There was the issue, though, of did it undermine his ability to do his job, or undermine the department's ability to do our job. And I feel strongly then, and I do now, that I believe that people can make mistakes, serious mistakes, and I believe that they can be redeemed. I believe that they can learn. And I believe if we really didn't feel that, then we wouldn't have this discussion. We wouldn't have all the organizations that are working to do that, to accomplish that. Frankly, we wouldn't have Rochester for Justice that's asking for change, because people wouldn't be able to respond to that productively and constructively. So I believe that was an issue, and I believe that given Ben's record and his past contributions, that he deserved an opportunity to redeem himself. Now, I know that most people don't agree with it, because there's people on one side that would believe they're simply offensive and he shouldn't work as a police officer, and there's people on the other side that believe that's simply a First Amendment right to free speech and there should be no discipline at all. And it's a little lonely right here in the middle. There's not a lot of people where I'm at, I get that. But I didn't make that decision believing that people would agree with me. I did that because I believe that was the right thing to do. There is another element that we have touched on, but it goes to that parallel that I was talking about, that as we talk about all of the really high-profile incidents that have occurred across the country, and we're focused on the officer's actions, and whether an officer should be held accountable or should be charged criminally for their actions. In back of those actions, there is a management, there's an administration that's making the policy, making the decisions in regard to management and supervision and training and equipment And none of that has been part of the discussion.
Okay.
That really brings to issue is this need for change is, yes, I believe the officer was wrong. And yes, I believe an officer, given their intent and their past record, should have the opportunity to redeem themselves. And that's my personal view on that. However, I don't think that management gets a free pass, that the management of the department, the administration can say, well, yes, that happened, but somehow we're not responsible for that. We are. And in this case, where if you read that report, you will see where Ben Schlag asked, after finding out that perhaps what he had put out on social media was offensive to people, am I doing something wrong? And he was told no. That is completely unacceptable. And that's where management needs to be held accountable. In this case, was. It's not that I don't think that people shouldn't lose their job over these type of issues, but the right people need to lose their jobs over these issues. And where management is responsible, and I will put this in personal context, if you were working at your job and you did something that prompted a complaint and you asked your management, is this okay? And management said yes. And then after the complaint was forwarded, management said, we're going to fire you for that, even though we said it was okay. That, you wouldn't think that was right. I don't think that's right. And I think our bigger problem was correct, as it is with all of these other issues we talked about. The bigger problem is management taking responsibility for what they do, not simply saying, well, if we fire the officer, this problem will go away. We need to fix that problem. We need to put the effort in, as we did in this case, to the education, not only that officer, but as he's been very willing to do, the education of others, his coworkers, and how this is impacting the community. But we need to step up on the management side and say that's not acceptable, that's not going to be tolerated, and we take appropriate action on it. And if we look at the very serious cases that have occurred across the country, the police shooting, where we have had that ongoing media, very public discussion about whether an officer was right or wrong, there's not been the discussion of whether management has fulfilled their responsibilities. And I think that's where and recognizing that people will disagree with me in regard to the discipline provided the officer, my focus is, has been, and will be on whether we're providing appropriate management, as opposed to whether an officer should have that opportunity to redeem himself.
Thank you very much. I guess we're looking like, the same glasses you're looking at the management to the police officers.
Yeah.
I guess that's what's going on.
And I want to say, I mean, it's not a free pass. It's not saying, I mean, in this case, the officer was suspended for 10 days. If the officer decided to litigate or grieve that through the arbitration process, I don't know if that would have been. Frankly, that wasn't what my decision was based on.
Exactly.
What would later happen with it. I think the key to it was the officer said, whatever that punishment is, I recognize I did wrong. I'm going to take responsibility for that. I'll give anybody a lot of credit, number one, for being honest, and number two, for taking responsibility for it. I have a lot less either appreciation or forgiveness from the management perspective where we fail in our responsibility. That, because in my department, that means that not only one officer can fail, but 140 others can do the same thing if we don't correct that. And I believe we have.
Thank you very much.
I want to be sure that all commissioners have an opportunity of asking any questions or making any comments before I open this discussion to the public. If there are no others, then I'm going to ask you, if you want to make public comment, to please identify yourself, because there's a tape, and if you represent an organization, please identify the organization, and then go ahead. I think, Ellie, I think you...
No, actually, I was just wanted to...
okay, yes.
I'm Kamal Wilkins, president of Rochester for Justice. One of the questions, and I think somebody brought it up last time, it might have been Aki last time, had said something, and I don't know that we had actually got an answer on the idea of, the depth of the investigation, right? Obviously, the public didn't get access to the report. But one of the questions that's kind of in the back of our heads is, were any of former cases, right? Things that Officer Schlag had done throughout his career. He's been an officer for 5 years. At any point, did anybody go back in to look at other cases that he may have been a part of that may have, and I'll kind of preface that with the idea of it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not you know how to use social media, right? You don't have to be able to write HTML language to use social media. We have 6-year-olds that have accounts, and your old racist grandpa can use social media without too much problem. And so the core of the message, right, the anti-Muslim rhetoric, which was probably the strongest of it, and the idea of running over protesters or anything that was racist, and things that were rather misogynistic. What that brings is a fear from the people, or maybe the idea that that's truly what's inside the soul, right? Those are things that he truly believes in, and that's why he would post bombing the Middle East, or radical Muslims, guns to their heads. So in relation to that, and that possibility that might be something that he actually feels akin to, right? Did we take a look back at anything else that he's done, if there have been previous complaints on his record for maybe somebody felt that there was an abuse of some sort, and then looking back at those investigations or those complaints and saying, okay, well, there's a pattern here that's developing, and this might also relate to other behavior previous to the social media discovery?
We certainly did look at that as more than this case in isolation. There wasn't, as you're describing, was there a pattern of complaints? There was not. Actually, looking at the record and documentation, there's not previous complaints in his record. I don't know if that would have meant that nobody ever made a complaint or that one never went forward. We certainly looked at that issue. We also looked at individual cases, criminal cases, which we were, I think, fairly confident that given the environment that he was working in, that there was always, it was a team of officers working on a single case, that there weren't independent decisions being made that would or could have been biased without some checks and balances being involved in that, both from the investigative standpoint and the prosecutor's standpoint. So we did look at those issues. No, we didn't find that pattern. No, we didn't find the previous history. And we also, when we looked at the context of those, and I know it's been interpreted that for instance, being religiously biased against Muslims because of the post in terms of radical Muslim. This is actually, when we had the previous discussion when Rochester for Justice had the march against police brutality, that many people, my staff included, heard anti-police. They didn't hear that brutality. And from Ben's reaction when he said anti-radical Muslim, certainly his military background said radical was the operative word, not Muslim, because radical Muslim in that context means terrorist, means ISIS. Is that the way everybody interprets it? Absolutely not. And as I said, I didn't feel, and I don't feel I could ascribe a meaning or an intent to that. It was offensive. That was the part that was important. But is it something that only has one interpretation? That is, that Ben could only have meant that one way. And I don't think that's the case either. Not my job to interpret that. It's my job to determine whether that undermines his ability to do his job as a police officer and subsequently impact the department. And I think we all agree it did that. And that's what I'm responding to. Not that I'm ascribing or replacing my own interpretation of what Ben's would be or what yours would be. I think it's important not to, in this case, to say there's not one single interpretation it is appropriate that we recognize that it's offensive and that it undermines the competence of the police department, and certainly not that officer. That's what we need to respond to, and that's what I have.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Tamika Coleman. I'm Vice President of Rochester Justice. I have two questions. First of all, you've mentioned several times that there was no record of misconduct. But if the person who was determining whether or not there was misconduct was problematic, how would you know?
That's, I think, a really, and when I say there was not, I want to be clear, there was not a record of misconduct. Now, that doesn't mean that all those complaints would have gone to that one person.
Okay.
It's very, I think the concern is if a normal complaint was made and then that person dismissed that complaint or simply didn't follow up on it, that would not mean that I would not have, or Ben's supervisor would not have, or other people in the department would not have heard about a complaint. Because generally, complaints are taken in and then go to the professional standards manager, so we would still have a record of that.
Okay.
If the professional standards manager didn't appropriately follow through, yes, that's problematic, but it doesn't mean that we would not have heard about it.
So they did not have the control to eliminate the record of the complaint?
Right, that would be in either mine or the individual supervisors, their own records that they keep in regard to a complaint being filed. And the follow-through, I agree, that's something that is really problematic from the standpoint of, what did you do in response? It's not so much in regard to whether a complaint was ever made, because we would still know that as a department. Would we know in every case? No, I don't think so, because conceivably a complaint could be made directly to that person, and if they simply didn't document it, you're right, we wouldn't know that. That's one of the issues, as we talked previously. This is not an issue that, okay, we dealt with this now, and Ben has been disciplined, and we're moving on. We recognize, and that's why when I talked to you previously, we would like your input, we'd like the commission's input on this professional standards manager position, not only in regard to who and how we hire somebody, but what their responsibilities are and what the checks and balances are. We've had that discussion internally, and I can tell you now that complaints don't and won't go to the professional standards manager. They'll actually go to, in this case, my administrative secretary, that all of them will be logged and filed, and then they'll go to the professional standards manager, so we'll know the answer to that. If if a complaint wasn't appropriately followed up on, that there's a separate file that says there was a complaint filed.
And my second question is this. A social network is a network. It's a lot of people. And you had said earlier in answering him that none of the investigations that Officer Slide was involved in were just him.
Correct.
Okay. But what is being done about the culture that allowed this to happen? Because this did not happen in a vacuum, and nothing will convince me that no other officers saw this.
Yeah, and I don't want you to. I think the standard, when we looked at should there be any other investigations, and you're very familiar with how social media works, so when things are posted, it doesn't mean that when people are sharing things or you looked at something that you necessarily agree with. What we're looking specifically at was somebody contributing to this, was somebody posting their own ideas that would have been equally offensive or given rise to that concern. The issue in terms of what are we doing about the culture that exists, one was, the direct response, okay, we're going to approach this from the standpoint of there needs to be intensive training, education, awareness on these issues, but recognizing, and this is a problem that I think all departments face to an extent, and certainly in Rochester, probably more so, given our history and our culture, is that we, like other departments, have tried to hire for diversity, and we find ourselves largely failing at that. And the reason in large part, is not because we don't want to or there's a lack of effort, but frankly, as we talked about these other issues, the system really is a really poor system for being able to do that. So we've approached this from the standpoint, we need to, as the same way we need to change the legal system, we need to change the hiring system. And now, instead of this blind system, if you will, of rating an application and blindly scoring candidates, the central part of the hiring process is cultural competency. As we're not asking some, you'll score higher because you're black or Asian, but we want to know what's your experience with different cultures and how have you been able to effectively interact and relate to different cultures, where that is the central piece of hiring as opposed to how many years experience you have and what was your grade point average. Because that frankly wasn't getting that job done. Now, that's preliminary. We made those changes last year. We're actually following through and assessing the results of that. I think they're better. They're not perfect. There's still changes we're every time that we're making to that. But one of the things that is helping us out tremendously with this cultural piece is previously we were getting applications from candidates, and for a police officer position, it's not unusual for us to get in excess of 200 applications. And those applications would be computer scored, grade point average, work experience, related down, you get a final one. We've completely done away with that. Now that when you apply at the police department, you're going to get a sit-down, face-to-face interview with our staff. And the questions will be, tell me about your cultural competency. Don't tell me about your grade point average, or that you worked 10 years for this police department. Tell me about how you're able to successfully navigate these issues. Does it give us greater diversity? I think it certainly does, because people are that have had the actual personal experience are obviously much more able to relate that experience. And that's been critical for us. Does it change a culture overnight? No. But I'm not naive enough to think that I can order that and that'll happen. That's the course that we're taking, though, in order to affect that change. We're also seeing not only on the entry-level part, but as the promotional process, that is, anybody that's going to move from officer to sergeant to lieutenant to captain has to go through that same process. And I will use this as an example. We had a lieutenant's test that was given last year, I believe. And in my participation in that, I make a written test. It's anonymous. I don't know who's writing the answers to that. But one of the questions on that particular test was, for instance, in regard to protests and marching. And what would you do in response to that? And anybody that couldn't articulate that a march against police brutality is something we actually support as opposed to something we police didn't pass that test. That's how we're changing that culture, to say those are the values that we need to really foster in our department. And if you don't have that picture, if you don't have that vision, you need not to do well. You can't progress unless you have that. So on both from the promotional side and from the entry-level side, that's where our focus is in terms of promoting that vision and certainly that experience.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Can I follow up with that?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for doing that. You said you're only by yourself. Is there anything as a community-wise that you need our support with, that we can help you with, put into, make it at least to the table?
I think there's actually, when I say, I'm kind of alone here in the middle, when I say that, I'm referring to this particular disciplinary issue. I think when we're looking at the bigger picture in terms of whether we're talking about cultural competencies, or whether we're talking the real systemic change that needs to happen in policing, there's a lot of support for that. And I found, frankly, a lot of support in places I didn't expect it. And I found some new friends that I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to meet. But I think that discussion has just started, and what we really need from the community is critical mass. We need to keep building on that, not saying, oh, okay, we fixed that. We haven't. There's a lot. As I said, it's not just an issue that relates to Rochester, or just an issue that I can fix within the department. It's really a much broader problem than that, and that critical mass needs to be there. And I think that people that are willing to stand up and foster change, demand change, I think is doing us a tremendous amount of good. But and I know, from my own perspective, it's hard work, and people get tired, and so we need to kind of support each other. And it's the change is not I work in a profession that is the most change-adverse profession I think you could reasonably find, and it's difficult to create that change, but it's happening. I mean, inevitably it's going to happen. We need to.
Let me a little bit be specific. Like, in the culture here in the city of Rochester, we don't know, we don't get involved, we have no clue. Like HR, like when you bring up those issues, and you say like, what, this computer scoring is just throwing darts in the darkest hole. Can we just have this? What is the response to you when we even attempt to bring up such things or change? Specifically, as far as here in the city of Rochester, I'm trying to find out if there's obstacles here even in the city for that change. Anything that we can do to help reach that?
I think that's one of the things that I think I've been very fortunate in that there are a lot of police chiefs that have very significant restrictions on what they can and can't do in terms of the management of their department. That's not the case here. That's good from the standpoint of it does give me a lot of latitude to address these issues. Bad from the standpoint when things go wrong. Yeah, they are my fault. But there has been a lot of support. One of the issues that I've been really pushing is, I think, I had this discussion just a little while ago where I was expressing that police officers need, in terms of use of force, they need the whole range of use of force options available to them. That's a human rights standard. It's not a U.S. standard, it's a human rights standard. But I was surprised to learn that not everybody recognizes that actually the Rochester Police Department is fairly unique in that regard, in that the city council, whenever I've asked for equipment related to the use of force and different options, that they've always been supportive. They've always done that.
Okay.
But in most police departments around the country, officers don't have that. And many officers, they don't even have a gun provided for them, much less other equipment. They have to get that on their own. And they're pretty much left up to their own discretion. And that creates a huge difference in terms of police response and all of the support and training and supervision that goes with that. So those things, we in Rochester have been very fortunate. When I have pursued changes in terms of the hiring process, in terms of policy around that, we're governed by a civil service board. They've been very supportive. I don't think they've ever turned me down on a proposal that I wanted to do something different. And I will tell you, this process that I described where we interview every candidate individually, face to face, is really labor intensive. And I was told, or asked, are you crazy? Are you sure you want to do that? Yeah, I think it's that important. But it's also been really important for our staff, because our staff conducts those interviews, and it gives them a much different perspective on, number one, that, yeah, there's actually people that want my job, but two, that they can really see where candidates, their background and their experience come in, how that connects to what they're expected to do as police officers. So I think we've had a lot of support organizationally and from the community here, and certainly when it comes to issues that I thought were really important in policing. I think what we need to recognize is that's not a universal. And you're right, in this community we can feel very fortunate about that, but in many others, most others, that is not the case. And that's why, as I said, the critical mass needs to be here, because creating change is more than just being comfortable in our own little bubble here. It's really setting a standard out there that makes us all better.
Yes, right.
Briefly, the NAACP Executive Committee received a copy of the investigator's report, I think, a day or two after it was made public by the city clerk. The committee has not had the opportunity to come back together since then due to some scheduling things. But at that initial review, they were concerned, very concerned about a couple of things in her comments. Specifically, that she did not indicate that the officer involved had directed apologies to those who were rightfully offended by what he had posted, and to the people of the city of Rochester to whom he owed a higher standard of behavior. They were also concerned that as she expressed what he was talking about doing in terms of working with other members of the department or whomever in terms of what he had done, that he seemed to be saying, well, I need to talk to them about the fact that you can really get in a lot of trouble by making comments on social media, not communicating to them that what he did was appropriate and he felt that anyone else who did something similar to this was inappropriate. So, as I say, I think that if we manage to get a meeting scheduled, that there may be some more formal communication, but that was at least the feeling of the executive committee upon the initial review of the investigator's report, her written report.
Let me address both of those points. The first, in terms of the overall, the more general apology. I did, which was published in the Post Bulletin and other news media organizations. There was the apology and explanation for discipline, etc. I need to take responsibility for that because I didn't make it clear. The only way that was conveyed was with the agreement and consent of Ben Schlag, otherwise it was all day Friday. And the intent was to convey that apology to the community and to his fellow coworkers, actually, that on my behalf, I apologize that it happened in our department, on Ben's behalf, that he was responsible for that. That was certainly the intent, and that letter was from both of us. That was created and signed by both of us that released that. The second point in regard to he was referring to how much trouble this could get you into. You are correct in that, and that is the way that he initially looked at that. That was prior to the 8 weeks of education training that he went to, that it was intended to address that very issue. It's not simply an issue of you can get in trouble for this, but you realize you're actually offending the people that you're supposed to be serving in this capacity. And that, I think, my belief is he has a different view of that, other than what was stated immediately to the investigator at the time, because obviously that was prior to any of that discipline or education taking place.
And as I say, all the committee was looking at was that investigator's report at that particular point in time. And I think that is, I think I've stated fairly what that document said. Now maybe, maybe he's gotten religion, to coin a phrase, during the subsequent period, but at least at that point, that's where it was.
Yeah, no, as I said, I think that's I don't think the report was inaccurate in that regard, but that was, in my view, one of the reasons that we needed to do the education as opposed to simply discipline.
Okay.
Sherwitz, for me, this might be a good time to remind those present of the community meeting that Rochester for Justice and others are convening in hopes that perhaps even the members of, or the executive committee from the NAACP can be present. And as a result of all of that, maybe potentially and ideally provide policy recommendations to us, because really we're not really so much about just hearing, but we're here to receive policy recommendations so we can then forward those potentially as recommendations to the police department. And while this provides a great opportunity for, or venue for the community to come and express, much like the chief indicated when he made his 21st Policing in the 21st Century presentation, it's more than just talk, okay? And so the responsibility of this commission is to evaluate existing, recommend perhaps future policy recommendations. So I encourage organizations, individuals to keep that in mind, because again, while this is an important opportunity to express thoughts, opinions, and beliefs, it really is outside of the function of this committee, or commission rather.
And to respond briefly to what you've said, Commissioner Barlow, item 8 deals with social media policy committee, of course, in a report, because that's, I think, one of the functions that the commission is undertaking at the moment, to review exactly that and to make recommendations regarding social policy. And I would hope that the members of that committee take into account the matter of the investigation of Schlag and the discussion and the report as well, and what actually happened as a background. Yes.
And just right on cue with that is actually listening to the chief talking about the central part of hiring being cultural competency, right? That's a huge piece in the sense of changing the culture of what's within the police department. Is that policy? And if it isn't, shouldn't it be? Because obviously we have a really good police chief right now, but we won't always have this police chief. And if we want Rochester to move on into the next generations, into being a progressive destination medical center, I mean, something like this policy or this practice of central part of hiring being cultural competence and promotions as well should be something that was set in stone, if at all possible, so that the next chief or the next hiring process or the next however that works out, this is something that becomes part of our actual police department culture through policy. And if the next guy who comes in to say, I'd like this job, sees that and realizes he doesn't want to hire 200 people, then he's not the right guy for the job. Right?
Thank you. Are there
culture, society, it's horrible.
So are there, if there are no other comments or questions, I'm going to move to the next agenda item, which is, this is a carryover from the last month's meeting, which is a discussion item for police body camera policy. And I think that there was at the end of that discussion last month, I think you mentioned, Chief Peterson, that the department is working on or doing some work. Yes. So I don't know that. Let's see what the commissioners want to do, but perhaps you can just bring us up to date with what the current situation is with the body camera policy at the moment.
The legislature in this last session had enacted a statute in regard specifically to police body camera. It changed some of the provisions that the Oversight Commission had previously reviewed and commented on our current body camera policy. Those things related, for instance, to the retention of data, where our current retention is 60 days. The legislation indicates it should be 90 days. There was the major change was the data privacy classification went from public to private. This is a significant benefit, at least from my perspective, that cameras can now be left on in situations that there would be an expectation of privacy, because the person that's the subject of that data can determine whether or not that would be released and it wouldn't be available publicly. That has the benefit, as I said, of where officers were responsible for turning the camera on or off, depending on whether they felt there was an expectation of privacy. We can have greater consistency that the camera would be expected to be on, and privacy issues will be handled through data privacy requests and private data classification. There are some exceptions to the private classification, and they specifically relate to when an officer discharges their firearm, or when there's substantial bodily harm as a result of police use of force, where after investigation it would be presumed that data would become public at that time. I think the point of concern for the Oversight Commission, and most of the discussion has been on the issue of whether an officer would be able to review data from the body cameras prior to writing the reports or not. That issue is, I think, handled within the data privacy classification. That is, 99.99% of those interactions are not use of force confrontations. That is, an officer is recording witness, victim, suspect statements or evidentiary issues related to a call. They do review those reports or that recording in order to make accurate reports. The question or the issue when there is a use of force incident that results in substantial bodily harm, or there's a discharge of a firearm, that issue, not that it's not a significant issue for those departments that investigate those particular incidents themselves, but we're not an agency that does that. That is, when that happens, we will always ask another law enforcement agency, most frequently, almost always the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, to investigate those incidents. So it's not an issue where our policy would prevail. That is, if we said officers can't look at the data, it's not our call to make because it's no longer our data. As soon as it's turned over to another agency, that becomes evidence and it's turned over to that, in this case, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. I did have direct conversation with Drew Evans, who's the superintendent of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, who indicated it is their policy that officers will not be able to review that data under those circumstances. It is a criminal investigation, so it's not one of those situations where he can say in every instance that would be the case. It really is case dependent. But their policy is not to allow that. As I said, not a call that we can make because it's no longer our data at that point. But our policy would not change as a result of that legislation. It would change as a result of another agency investigating. Those are the highlights of the changes in that. We will provide a copy of the updated policy. We've just gotten a model policy that we're comparing to our own. So Terry will be sending that to you, I assume, fairly shortly. It does need to be enacted by the first of the year. that if we have to have that kind of policy on record. So we'll certainly get it by that time, but I anticipate you'll get it this month.
Okay.
Correct.
So we put that on the agenda as an item when there's something to discuss, actually, and the
Yeah.
document is being circulated to us. Are there any comments or questions from commissioners first?
Chief Peterson, wasn't there some kind of sentence that said, in those scenarios, like, you know, they refer back, they give the option to the departments, to the local departments to do however they see fit? Was there something to that effect?
Yes, that is the issue, as I said. Currently, one of the things we need to address in that larger picture, but currently it is purely a discretionary or policy decision on the part of the department whether an incident is turned over to another agency for investigation. We do that as a matter of course. As long as I've been here, when a serious incident like that occurred, we turn it over to another law enforcement agency. Recognizing that there are a number of agencies that investigate those incidents themselves, that's where it becomes relevant in terms of policy of whether officers will be able to look at videos, et cetera. It doesn't apply because we turn it over to another agency. And then their policy would apply. In this case, as I said, the DCA's policy is that officers will not look at that. So I'm assuming that's not an issue for us locally because we have that. I think there is a larger discussion to be had as we look at the systemic issues within law enforcement. I don't, reasonably believe that law enforcement agencies investigating officer-involved shootings themselves brings with it the credibility that the community would demand. And I think we would see that change as a matter of policy, if not law. But that's certainly one of the things that is changing as we've seen these issues.
There's a case going on in Chicago right now where the officer turned off his camera at the critical moment where something was supposed to be recorded. And by listening to the MBR and reading about it, I kind of gathered information that the camera was kind of new to him, and he was saying he didn't know how to he didn't even get adjusted. He didn't have enough time to learn to to program himself to turn it on. And you talked about training here in the camera. So will that be, like you said, I'm trying to get it now it's compulsory that it has to be on 24/7, or they can shut it off and on, or how's that work?
Right. It's the camera is not on 24/7.
Okay.
And that's a practical issue.
Exactly. And
we probably don't need the video of the officer ready to record. But the expectation, I think before, where officers were trying to balance privacy expectations with the potential that it might be evidentiary or be necessary to have the video. I think the legislation has helped a lot, that our policy will be going forward, that if you're interacting with the public, you should have your camera on. Not necessarily when you're sitting in your squad car alone, those kind of things, but when you're interacting with the public, that camera is on. So if something develops that you didn't anticipate, that camera's. Now, the issue in Chicago that you referenced, where and I believe the police chief there referenced that they had only had these cameras out for a week or less than a week, and they weren't familiar how to operate them. I'm not, here to say that that's valid or not valid. I know in training our own staff that issue of balancing privacy against the expectation was very difficult for officers. When you went into a situation, for instance, a domestic assault, and you're going into a home that you don't know what's going on, well, there is an expectation of privacy. It's a private residence, but there's also some violent activity. That's why we're here, so that could lead to a use of force. So do I turn this on or off? And I know officers had significant issues with trying to sort that out. This makes it much easier. Our staff has had them deployed now for a number of months. We have actually, since we deployed those cameras, in that short period of time, the Axon cameras, who is the vendor, have actually come up with a new model that addresses many of the operational concerns. And because we had deployed them when we did, they actually made them available to us without extra cost. They wanted them all to be on the same system. But it solved two problems for us. One was it was very difficult. When officers turned these on, there was a bright green light that came up, which is fine for telling people that you're recording. Not so fine if you're in a situation where there's an active shooter or there's somebody that's barricaded and you're lit up like you have a green bullseye. So they made it actually so you can dim the light on these. They still record, but they have different levels of lighting. The other is, as we saw in the incident in Baton Rouge, where much of that incident was not recorded because it's reported that the camera was knocked off or fell off. And we've actually experienced that a number of times with our staff, that the cameras were coming off, they were falling off, and the new cameras have a magnetic system that's much more stable. And I think that'll help a lot as well. But this is an evolving technology. They're going to get better, and we're seeing that fairly rapidly. But a lot of those issues that we've seen in different parts of the country, we've seen here. They haven't been major issues because there hasn't been any complaint associated with them or any serious incident. So we've been able to address those probably without quite the spotlight that other agencies are going through. But those are real things that we need to address in terms of the reliability and how the cameras are used and how we train officers to use them so they're comfortable with them and we're getting the data that we expect.
And I know this question is kind of situational, but what happens when an officer doesn't turn the camera on and there is a serious case, for example, shooting? What is the identification? Is there any policy or procedure that says then you're 90% guilty?
Well, it does come down to why was the camera on?
Exactly.
And as we've seen when under the previous law where officers were expected to be turning that camera on and off, sometimes under some really bad circumstances, because I don't want them thinking about cameras when they should be thinking about people. But I think this law, the change in the law does make it increase the expectation that the cameras will be on because they don't need to think about that expectation of privacy. And it does change our thinking in terms of why isn't the camera on? Have we had our issues with officers that have forgot to turn the camera on? Yes, we have. We've had squad car videos for close to a decade. And we still have officers that, the cameras automatically come on, but they forget to turn the audio on when they're talking to somebody. And as I said, most of them are very innocent. There's not a reason that the audio wouldn't be there. But when you have the exchange that happens where something does go bad and the audio's not there and the video's not there, that's a problem. We need to look very hard at why is the camera off. And if it's intentional, that is no different than dishonesty in my view. And I told you there's no tolerance for the dishonesty aspect. But we do need to recognize that officers are people and they do make mistakes too, and that sometimes there are innocent mistakes made. The technology is getting better, that I think the chances of that are less and less. And we will see the point where cameras, and we're working with IBM now on a camera analytics product that it actually senses, the camera senses, for instance, rapid motion or violent motion or muzzle flash or even crowd density issues, and the camera will automatically come on, so officers don't have to be thinking about that. So those are some of the things in the future that will eliminate some of those. In the meantime, we're going to have to do the best we can with, if we establish that it was done maliciously, you can't work here. If you make an honest mistake, work with you to fix it.
There could be some systematic error too that just doesn't turn on.
It does. Yeah. They're not infallible. Yeah, they do break at times. They are getting better. I am impressed with how quickly the technology is evolving, because as I said, we didn't have our cameras out on the street for 3-4 months before we replaced them with
New ones,
Yeah,
yeah.
the new ones.
Thank you.
I will say that I had the opportunity to ride with an officer who was one of the first officers to have the body camera, and those things did actually occur.
Yeah.
We were called to a situation that was it was a medical situation, and it quickly changed to an aggressive person, where then it was a violent situation where the body camera could have been on, but because it was a medical and it was initially it was a medical situation that changed actually very fast, and not the way it unfolded was that I don't know how he could have activated.
Yeah.
And then later on in the evening, because we were there for about an hour and a half, this person actually ended up knocking off the body camera from the officer's body, and it wasn't intentional, but it did happen. So it's interesting that those were two of the situations. But I know Rebecca and I have said this, but I would really encourage you to ride with an officer, because it's a lot different seeing it from the passenger seat, things that are happening.
I mean, like you can imagine an officer coming to their house like for a medical and then hitting a gunshot right away, he comes in, and you go like, how on earth would you think to even turn it on, or like, you know, what to do in that situation?
And even to
It's
see,
difficult.
yes, how fast things
How fast things
unfold
happen, yeah.
and change. It was,
I have a question, Chief, and the cases of, for example, and I don't know if you have had them, like, we all know that officers have their cameras on, and do you still have incidents where somebody wants to come up and say, hey, I will give some information, but you need to turn your camera off? So is that still happening? Is that still an option? Can they turn it off?
Yeah.
When someone who wants to testify or do something, say privately without being in the video?
They will respect that privacy, that if somebody doesn't want, they don't want to be recorded, yes, we will try to honor that. There will, as you mentioned, there are some of these that there may be circumstances where issues develop that there's a potential for the use of force, and officers are expected then that needs to be recorded. Well, they always have the opportunity, not necessarily, but we will try to, under those circumstances where somebody says, I don't want to be recorded, we'll certainly try to honor that. If the officer reasonably feels, though, that this is a situation that could potentially result in some violence, whatever that circumstance might be, that be recorded, so there's not a question as to what the officer did or didn't do.
So Chief, how would that be different from me as a criminal saying to the police officer, get your camera out of my face?
There's a...
You see that a lot, like, you know, people that being recorded say like, get this camera out of my face. I mean,
there is a requirement when we take statements from suspects. This is different from witnesses or victims.
Okay.
If we're taking statements from suspects, there's a requirement that be recorded in Minnesota at least. And officers, of course, what we're talking about under those circumstances is evidence, not a circumstance where we're just recording somebody, in order to keep data on it. That would only be done under circumstances where it would provide evidence of a crime, and that's why we need to record that interaction.
but in that case, the officer can also say, if he feels this person has information, I'll take you down to downtown or like near the office to have off-camera meetings instead of like trying to shut it off in a camera where the commotion and things are happening.
No, and that's very true. It can happen under different circumstances. But if we are taking a statement or we're interacting with a person with the intent to use that as evidence against them, we need to record it.
Okay,
That would be the difference.
gotcha, thank you.
Commissioner Barlow, you had a question?
Yes. the chief will be providing updates on the body cam policy, and we will probably have opportunity in advance of the September meeting to review, and at the September meeting probably to discuss. So I'm comfortable with waiting till then to further discuss this evening. At least we find ourselves doing it again twice. But also, it provides an opportunity for, again, just making that shout out for the upcoming community meeting.
Yes.
Some of these questions, I think, are better asked in a community meeting forum where, you know, the chief can, because again, we're focusing on the policy versus what about and what about and suppose this. I mean, because the community, it provides a great opportunity for the DSU inquired then, well, suppose a citizen said, get the camera, I don't want you, you know. Well, citizens need to know what's a reasonable request or not. Do they have the right to demand or to say, and what happens if their inquiry is not honored or respected? And I think this is communication. And I think that the chief and other community organizations are saying, you know, we're all about that. But this committee, it's not designed to be that vehicle. We can receive that information and see where there's a policy opportunity, but to be that, we're not a community organization per se that is intended to process this level of questioning. In my opinion, as my wife oftentimes reminds me, I can be wrong. And but if we have kind of covered most of the salient points, so we could probably move forward.
Yes, we've probably exhausted the topic, but I think it's fair to say that members of the public who have questions and are present and may not be able to attend the community forum should be entitled to ask. And I think we've as you say, Commissioner Ball, I think we've covered the topic. So on the assumption that there are no further comments or questions, we'll move on to the next item.
I just have one, I'm curious about this, about the technology. Has there been any consideration given, to your knowledge, Chief, to make it voice activated? Not just generally voice activated, but a keyword, for example, a word that would, you know, not be used in ordinary circumstances.
Yes,
has there been any consideration of that?
There has. There are currently, to my knowledge, there are no existing models up, or the beta testing that takes place. The technology is not advanced far enough that it would be keyword activated or those things. The feeling, and I take this from our discussions with IBM, who's more focused on analyzing the data that's provided. Not they don't produce cameras, but they do deal with the data that's produced. And there hasn't been, at least in that field, a great movement towards voice activation because the activation of the camera just in of itself is fairly, you know, it's got a button on it that you press. So what has been discussed are certain circumstances that you would want the camera to automatically activate. And one of the examples they use, for instance, is muzzle flash. This camera is recording all the time, but not storing the data. So if it's activated, it actually captures the last 30 seconds of data that was recorded and preserves that. So if a muzzle flash went off, it would preserve that previous 30 seconds of data and everything that happened subsequent to that. So it's really been focused on those type of incidents that you would want the camera to automatically capture that data, more so than an activation that's really been difficult to capture, and you know exactly what voice sequence or what would you capture or want to turn that camera on. How would that happen? That would be a benefit as opposed to just manually turning the camera on. So I think that as we looked at video cameras in general, which is now evolving into the body cameras, things that happen that would trigger automatic recording that we've seen in some video systems. For instance, somebody falling over, the camera is able to assess that particular action, and that would trigger automatic reporting and recording. Muzzle flash, in some cases with video cameras, as I said, the crowd density, if you have a lot of people in a given area, it'll automatically trigger the camera activation. Those are things that they're looking at from the standpoint of capturing things that an officer otherwise would not necessarily have the time or the recognition to do that, because you do capture this previous 30 seconds of data, of information. So I think that's where the technology is going. Would it be voice activated? Very possibly, because there are certain things, or perhaps a certain level of volume that would activate it. Not only the muzzle flash, but the gun report, or not only the certain words, but a certain volume of words. If something were shouted as opposed to spoken. Probably do that.
Okay, thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is just a report as to the status of the work of the Social Media Policy Committee.
Well, I chair that subcommittee, and as we are aware, the ball is not in the chief's hand, but in the Director of Human Resources. And so pending what the chief has to say will determine potential recommendation that I have to make.
The Director of Human Resources did draft a model policy based on the information that you have provided, as well as information from a number of different cities, some in Minnesota, some not. That draft policy was presented to department heads in a meeting that occurred I think August 1st. And based on the recommendations from department heads, that's being redrafted and will, I believe, will be referred to the city council for action as a city organizational policy, not simply a police department policy, but would have specific section, at least as written, has sections that relate specifically to the police department, but is now being looked at as an organizational policy. I will get an update on that and provide that to you, probably the other policies that we disseminate.
So, Chair Witz, oftentimes there's a question raised regarding the effectiveness of government, or government's ability to govern and to respond to community or the well-being of its citizenry. And without any question, taxpayers bore a cost for this investigation. Whether there was malfeasance or bad intent is not the case. There was not that policy would have illuminated what occurred or training. But I'm hoping, and I don't know if there is if city council members are assigned responsibilities, a governance responsibility, you may know, or the deputy city attorney may know. But if there is a council member that shoulders the burden of Police Policy Oversight Commission, and let me hold at that point, are you aware that whether or not an assignment exists, and if so, what council member has the Police Policy Oversight Commission responsibility?
I'm not aware of any council member who has been specifically designated as having responsibility for this commission.
And then if I may ask,
Yes.
are council members assigned, routinely assigned commission responsibilities?
Short answer, I'm not sure. I think under select circumstances they are, but to my knowledge, there has not been a council member assigned to this commission, but I can certainly inquire.
And the only reason I asked is, this rose to a level of great concern within the community. The department probably shouldered a great burden and continues to do so. And this is not rocket science. I mean, cities many times larger than Rochester were able to successfully navigate the development of a policy in relatively short order. And I guess I'm just surprised. Well, it's good to hear, and I certainly, Chief, I'm not, as you say, tossing any salt your way. But I mean, if there could be some urgency assigned to this, because the community, I think, is deserving of that. To know that when issues are identified, when department heads are able to agree, yeah, there was a problem. Okay, I've heard no denial, and that's commendable on the part of the chief. And so oftentimes, at least in my mind, it is good government for there to be priority assignments made when community issues such as this occur. And I don't know if, as chair, you have any leverage or any ability to make a call or to kindly suggest that and make aware that, you know, not only the community but the commission is eagerly awaiting, you know, the policy, so we can say again back to the community, we've heard the concern, we've acted upon it, we've recommended, or the chief has, the department has developed policy that we have evaluated and have offered comment on, also giving them the community an opportunity and potential bringing closure. It's always good to be able to, for everyone to have a toast of tea and say, you know, we are moving forward. And there really, in my estimation, is not a need for things to linger.
I'm very happy to take it up with the chair of the council and find out to the extent that we can have any influence on what they're doing and speed things up. Absolutely.
Yeah, good luck with that. This is just an indication example. Chief, can I ask?
Yes, go ahead.
No, just something off subject that.
Well, I think what I'm going to do, because I think that Ray Schmitz had some public comment, and public comment was at 5, but I don't know that I necessarily made it very clear at the time. So I'm going to get Ray, before we move into the old business section on the agenda, I want to open it up for public comment again to give Ray an opportunity, and then please go ahead.
Moving to a topic of only of interest to us, data privacy nerds. The legislature did pass legislation concerning license plate readers 2 years ago. There were a number of things that were required of cities using the technology. The effective date was delayed. I'm curious whether the city has submitted to you those updated policies in conformance with the legislation from 1.5 years ago. And this particularly was brought to my attention because apparently now the parking enforcement people are using license plate technology. I thought it was intriguing that the city clerk appears to be running the program as opposed to law enforcement, and I wonder if the policies have been updated to reflect the fact that we now have an unsworn individual using the technology to and having access to the data. So I guess I'm just questioning whether you've had the opportunity to review the updated procedures, and if not, where that might be.
Yeah, I don't believe we've had such an opportunity. I don't believe the document has been circulated to us. I certainly haven't received it. I imagine no other commissioners have. So it's something that we can follow up as well.
So are you asking that of the chief?
I was actually in the chair.
Okay.
Again, I don't know. I guess the chief could respond on where the policies are.
I can add, yeah, the license plate reader requirements from the legislature. We have, through a pretty extensive process of programming, are now in compliance with those in reporting and auditing.
Okay, good, because that's what was delayed.
Right, that was the, and it did give us the opportunity, as I said, the requirements of the law, while the data elements were being collected, they were not readily available. And we have since written a program that makes those readily available on data requests. That not only can we provide them an auditor, but we'll be able to provide them to a citizen that would ask for them. In regard to the issue, as you said, of license plate readers being used for parking enforcement. Specifically, what that refers to is it's not a police department function, but people that are parking in parking ramps and the people that, we don't do the enforcement there, but Public Works does.
Well, and apparently they're also looking at the neighborhood parking.
Yeah, permit parking.
Permit,
And those kind of things. And we have involvement in that aspect of the permit parking. But what you're speaking of, the reason that as you said, the city clerk is the central point of data release for the city, that is, they're the designated, he is the designated individual for that data release, and that's why that information is going through the city clerk's office. That information is coming from Public Works. From the extent it's coming from the police department, we would be able to provide the data, or the city clerk would be able to provide the data. Ultimately, the requests will be referred to us through that central point, if you're aware of it.
But who's writing the policy then? If, for example, the law requires that there be a log of who has access to the information. There has to be a log of when the technology is used. All sorts of
And we are
picayune requirements in the statute.
There are. We are writing a policy for the police department, and we are providing that data log and those elements that are required. I can't speak for Public Works in terms of, I know that there's some license plate data readers that they use for, as I said, parking ramp enforcement and those kind of things. I can't speak to another department's policies. I assume they're there, but I'm not going to tell you they are unless I know that for a fact. I can't go that far. I can only speak for the police department.
And will this body have the opportunity to review those then?
Well, certainly, if the commission would like, as I said, I don't know that they're a Public Works Oversight Commission, but...
Well, no, I understand, but at least the law enforcement part of
Yes,
it.
absolutely. We can make that available as well as a report. So you can see the format and what is actually being audited and reported.
Because you're aware, there are a number of people who are concerned about the fact that this information, number one, the retention period for it, but also the access to it has all sorts of data privacy issues regarding the fact that you're monitoring all sorts of people who are not committing any crime when the police car is being driven down the street and it's recording all the cars that are parked along the street. So
it collects a tremendous amount of data, and the reporting aspect of that is significant. It is. I think we can demonstrate what we're collecting, and in terms of what you're saying, number of license plates that were read, number of hits for various reasons, all of that information to provide in a summary form.
And who has access to it and all this stuff.
Okay, Commissioner Robley, I think you had a
Thank you.
question or comment.
I think, I was thinking about it along the same problems. I watch this program called Parking Wars. Nowadays they have everything, anything that you can imagine as a TV show too, and and I was thinking about that, but what happens over there is they have already uploaded the data of the vehicles that have outstanding tickets, and then as soon as the camera catches those tags, it blinks for them, and they stop and they put their cars to get the money out of them. You owe $300 to city pay, as opposed to the one in the police where they might be looking for criminal or something like that, and then they get more data, as opposed to parking ticket.
I think that's certainly a valid point of discussion for the commission, because the technology in general, and license plate readers in particular, can obviously be used for a wide range of purposes. And yes, we can use them to identify, and do use them to identify stolen vehicles.
Yeah.
It'll immediately notify an officer that that vehicle is stolen. Is it appropriate that they tell you when, that person hasn't paid their parking ticket? I think that's a public policy decision. I will tell you, I have personal concerns about our current practice in terms of issuing warrants for people based on parking tickets. The alternative, as I say, is booting cars or addressing vehicles as opposed to people. But this is a circumstance that it's part of a larger issue in terms of how people are policed. And when people, for instance, that don't have the means to pay a parking ticket, have a warrant that's issued for them, and then they're arrested, and in order to get out of jail, they have to pay bail, and then they can't do that. And there's bad things that happen. And I think in terms of that larger picture, that there is some necessary discussion that needs to take place about how we deal with, whether it's parking tickets or other low-level offenses, that don't simply make us a revenue-generating agency based on the people that are least able to pay. I think that's a really valid discussion to have in terms not only of police department, but of city policy and how we address those things. It is very easy, I know from my perspective, to say, well, the technology will do all of this for us, but it doesn't necessarily take into account that collateral damage that happens as a result of that. I think that we need to take a hard look at those issues and what impact they're having on people that are being policed, as opposed to, whether the technology is effective and efficient. It certainly is, but it doesn't necessarily.
Thank you. What I was going to ask you was what is your thought about Minneapolis Police's decision today? Minneapolis Police, they came up with a decision today about policing and de-escalation of situations. I don't know if you heard that or not.
Well, I know, I certainly know what's been under discussion. What I think we need to address is that we've heard politically that, the solution to policing in this country lies in community policing. Well, community policing is a good thing, but frankly, we've employed that for the last 30 years in the nation. And that didn't solve the serious problems that we're seeing in terms, particularly with police involved too. We've also heard that, well, police training is the answer. Well, if you continue to train to the same standard, you'll get the same result. I can absolutely guarantee that. Likewise, when we say training and de-escalation techniques and those kinds of things, all of those are really good things. I'm never going to speak against police training or community policing or de-escalation, but they don't address the underlying significant issues with the legal system that simply set a different bar than the rest of, globally, the rest of the world is looking at.
Those being what we talked about last month.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get distracted from those very central issues of how we need to fundamentally change our approach to these issues by saying we have this program or we have this program, when you're not actually addressing, here's the problem. This is fundamentally what needs to be changed. And I think we'll have a forum on Thursday to discuss those issues in greater detail. But all of those things are truly laudable pursuits. They are, and I don't mean to speak ill of them, but I am very wary of a political solution to, that doesn't address the fabric of the underlying issues, because they're simply politically expedient. I mean, if you, as a politician, if I were a politician, and I'd never be successful at it, but if I were to say, well, community policing is a good thing, we should do community policing, that's a good deal. Well, nobody's going to say, no, that's a horrible idea. But it's not going to, like I say, we've done that. That's not created a solution to we shoot 3 people a day. Is community policing going to solve that? So let's address the real problem. So I'm not denigrating any of the solutions to the training or the programs that are out there that I think are necessary and will be beneficial. But I don't want to see those happen in lieu of systemic changes that need to occur.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other comments, we're going to move into old business. Is there any old business that anybody wants to raise? Hearing none, we move into new business. The only new business that I have is just to make sure that the commissioners have given their emails to Rochester for Justice. I know there was a request this morning, and I want to be sure that you got all the information that you needed.
It's being worked on.
Okay, yeah, so. I think
Yeah,
we
not
should-
everyone has responded.
So this is a good time. There has been a request from Rochester for Justice there's been a request from Rochester for Justice to make the commissioners' emails available. I have sent my email, and I would ask commissioners to please do the same, to give Carrie permission or not, hopefully yes, to communicate those emails to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other new business? If not, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Any